My name is Jordan. I'm from Oceans, Reefs, and Aquariums. You guys might know us from as ORA. And this is my friend, Jonathan Foster, founder of Fisheye Aquaculture, also located in sunny Florida. Jonathan, do you have anything?
No, you got that.
Okay. Hey, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of aquaculture, and then how it's come to where we are today, and the importance of why you need aquaculture in your retail fish store setting. Let's start back a couple thousand years ago. China was actually one of the leaders in aquaculture, where they started developing pond structures for a local species of carp. They kept them for food production. During the next several thousand years, they actually modified and kept records, which is something that up until this point had been unheard of, keeping records on sizes and the construction of their ponds, food types, and fry rearing technology. This actually started to spread throughout the Asian continent as Chinese immigrants pushed on into the other countries in surrounding areas. Since then, you started seeing a lot of other historical uses for aquaculture. Romans using mussels and oysters. It wasn't until actually the 1960s, however, that everything dramatically changed with the advent of granulized pelletized food for aquaculture. Up until then, it had been just a byproduct of the agricultural industry, like raw meat for feeding these fish. So once you started using a processed diet, you were able to more fine-tune the special nutrients, sizes, and other facets that you needed for aquaculturing the food fish you were raising. The 1970s saw the rise of marine fish for aquaculture. You started seeing pompano. However, it really started to struggle with any industry. You start seeing environmental impacts and the profitability issues of raising these fish as opposed to taking from the wild. And a lot of them actually struggled during this time. However, by 2013, so much had changed that we were actually aquaculturing more fish per year than were being taken out of the ocean. In the 1960s, Germany really started pressing forward with marine fish in home aquariums. Now, we know that people were using saltwater fish in aquariums up until the 1930s. However, the 1960s, Germany really started pushing this as a hobby. United States wouldn't follow through until another 10 years after that.
I was going to say it was around that time too that there was you had Martin Moe and Frank Hoff started realizing that, hey, we could use all of these culture techniques that we're using for marine food fish and apply them towards these ornamentals and see if it works.
Right. And so Martin Moore, for example, actually was one of the first people to raise a Amphiprion ocellaris clownfish. His pet fish started spawning. He started using the information he used from raising pompano and using the certain types of foods for fry, found that he could do it, saw that he could have hundreds of fish produced from a single clutch of eggs, and realized there was a lot of commercial application to what he had achieved. Because of this, you also saw a lot of fish being taken from the wild to feed the really increase in the aquarium industry's need for fish. So these two things started going hand in hand. You started seeing a lot of fish being more accessible to the aquarium industry, and also a really growing demand for aquaculture. At this time, there really wasn't a lot of available options for fish. I mean, you had angelfish, you had butterfly fish, you had the common clownfish, but the collection methods were pretty rudimentary, and they were still Passover tools from when they were using for the food industry. So you were seeing a lot of dynamite, cyanide use in order to capture these fish and get them to U.S. markets, European markets. But by 1980s, you started seeing Germany ban these fish. No more angelfish, no more butterfly fish. And what they actually created was this vacuum with hobbyists who needed something else to fill their tanks. So they started experimenting with live corals, which up until this time hadn't been done. People were using dead corals as decorations, or if they were using corals, they were with the expectation that it would just die and become a decoration that you would replace. When Germany started experimenting with these live corals, an entire other industry started to catch up. So you started now seeing lighting, foods, additives, really addressing the issues that live corals demanded in the home aquarium, which then in turn benefited only the fish as well, because up until that time also, people were using freshwater tools, underground filters, large granulated pieces of rock. Their metal items that they were including in their aquariums were starting to rust. You had salt creep. You had a whole another series of issues that were being addressed now finally in the 80s. Want to talk about 1990s?
Yeah, sure. So in the 1990s, you started seeing not only with the advent of technology that would really assist in a hobbyist becoming successful, but there started becoming actual aquaculture farms dedicated towards marine ornamentals. You had Sequest start up in Puerto Rico with Bill Addison. There was Aqualife in the Bahamas, which I think was Martin Moe, right?
Not sure.
I think it was. Reef propagation in Chicago. There was Desert Fisheries in Utah. However, they still, the market wasn't that broad. There still wasn't that many hobbyists out there, and those companies, they struggled. It was around that time too, I think in the late 90s. Let's see, ORA came on the scene.
1996.
With Harbor Branch. Right.
So one of the issues that a lot of these hatcheries were having was there was a market, there was a demand for aquacultured fish. However, wild-caught fish were so much cheaper. It was a problem for these wholesale distributors to bring in these overpriced aquacultured fish. They had cultivated relationships with divers and collectors in many of the countries around the world. And so now you had these hatcheries who were more domestic, but the prices were so much higher. So there was that barrier getting aquacultured fish to the end user, the hobbyist. During the heyday, Sequest actually was producing upwards of 250,000 fish a year. That's a lot of animals. But again, the bottleneck was getting those into the marketplace. 20 employees, 550 broodstock pairs. I mean, this was a no small operation. However, because of the profitability issues that you saw in the early aquaculture with food fish, a lot of these failed. By the end of the 90s, only 2 of them were around. ORA had started really getting some traction, and it wasn't really until 2003 that you saw an incredible surge in the demand for aquacultured fish, particularly because of Finding Nemo, Ocellaris clownfish. Also during this time,
Thank God for Finding Nemo.
Thank God. One of the big things you started to see in the changes were an increase in demand for reef tanks. So again, the population was shifting their interests from just fish only, triggers, lionfish. Now you wanted to start dealing with shrimps, corals, and it opened up the door to all sorts of new technologies that were passed down from the first steps that Germany helped out with all their technology. In 2001, the Ocean Institute of Hawaii first started working with captive-bred yellow tangs. I mean, that was something they thought needed to be achieved, a pelagic species of fish, and we'll come back to what they accomplished later. So around 2017, Florida Atlantic University acquired the Oceanographic Institute at the Harbor Branch facility. At the time, ORA was just processing, getting domesticated aquacultured fish to a commercial size scale and scaling up what they'd achieved. After that 2007 merger, by 2011, ORA had become a private entity when a for-profit business, ORA, could no longer be invested with a non-for-profit university. So now skip ahead a couple more years. 2015, the Oceanographic Institute of Hawaii had finally achieved yellow tangs as an aquaculture fish. That's 15 years. So a lot of times people ask, why don't we see yellow tangs in mass in retail aquariums? It's a very lengthy, arduous process that took 15 years to perfect, and even now, we're still not at the level where we can scale it up to a commercial level. But what we started seeing now is the same tools that commercial hatcheries were using were now being utilized in small, home-sized facilities. So you saw the rise of a small company in Florida, Poma Lab Industries. Now they're using the same technologies that large-scale commercial enterprises are using, much smaller scale, much more finely focused, and are raising pelagic species of angelfish and angelfish hybrids. Additionally, as soon as the news came out about aquacultured yellow tangs, the same information was applied to the blue hippo tang from the University of Florida Tropical Aquaculture Lab. All of these things help in substantial ways communicating what the benefits are of aquaculture to the hobbyist, the end user. I'll let Jonathan talk a little bit more about that.
All right, so kind of what I wanted to touch on was, he made a mention about domestication of fish. Right around that time of the early 2000s, 2003 to, right around 2007, you started seeing, in aquaculture, survival of the fittest doesn't apply, so you get domestication, and you start getting clownfish that don't look normal. And they're, not that they're ugly, they're actually beautiful. They come up with crazy patterns. They're either all white or a lot of white. And the hobbyist loved it. And that really helped drive, I think, even more aquaculture facilities to start up for the drive to produce these fish, because they were high in demand. And they not only were they high in demand, but they were, they had significant value, sometimes almost 2 or 3 times as much as your normal striped clownfish. I know, our company, Fisheye Aquaculture, that's how we got started. We started breeding these designer clownfish, and the money that came in really allowed us to grow, and it also allowed us to play around, research with other species.
So what basically we've touched on is wild type fish phenotypes were the in-demand aquaculture variety. You were seeing the 3-striped clownfish, you were seeing wild type fish. It wasn't until the aberrant fish came into the scene that people started seeing there was a level of customization to the fish that became desirable. That desirable qualities became the designer clownfish. And just like the regular Oscularis clownfish is, without a doubt, the biggest drive of hobbyists getting into our industry, the designer clownfish reinvigorated that once more, and it allowed hobbyists a personal touch to their aquarium they didn't have before. So now suddenly you had patterns, you had colors, you had shapes, all the fun aspects that people were lacking in the marine hobby that they were getting out of the freshwater side was now driving an entire new interest in aquaculture. Similar to what Jonathan was saying, when you started seeing the revenues from these aberrant forms of fish, it allowed you to expand into other species of aquaculture. For example, the Bengay cardinalfish. This was a fish that was discovered in '94. By '95, they were importing 700,000 of these fish per year just to meet the demand. You saw a 90% decline in their availability in the wild, with some local areas actually going extinct. However, due to aquaculture and the different things we were able to accomplish, now we have a single farm in Thailand who's basically meeting the entire wild-caught demand for just that fish by producing well over 120, I've heard even upwards of 400,000 fish per year. That fish, when it first came on the market, was a $300 fish when you bought it at a retail store. Now you find them for less than 30. It's an incredible thing that we've been able to accomplish, letting wild populations recuperate by feeding the demand with aquaculture. Another example would be the orchid dottyback from the Red Sea. A very remote fish at the time, well over $100 when you wanted to buy at retail. Now you can find them almost everywhere, and they're an incredibly popular and wonderful fish. I've got them in my home aquarium. As a personal anecdote to how aquaculture benefits, I'm a huge clownfish aficionado. I really like them a lot. As a hobbyist, the holy grail of the fish were the wideband clownfish out of southern Australia and the Mauritian clownfish from Mauritius. Now, as a hobbyist, that would be impossible for me to acquire the import rights and pay the fees to get those fish just into the States on my own. But 2 local people were breeding these species, Karen Britton in Hawaii and a woman named Marina in the U.S. Was actually aquaculturing these 2 fish. I was able to acquire them as a hobbyist, which would have been impossible to do as a hobbyist for a wild-caught specimen. Current estimates right now, 350 aquacultured species of fish are available to hobbyists. It's in some capacity. So some of the benefits you're also seeing as well are with the local economies that used to depend solely on wild collection. Now, I don't think you can have one without the other. As Jonathan said to me earlier, they do complement each other, aquaculture and wild collection. As aquaculture goes up, it removes the need for these fishermen in these local tropical areas to collect fish from their own areas. But that doesn't mean that they suddenly dry up and have no source of income. What they shift to is aquaculture of corals. They do things that become and allow them to be stewards of their reef, protecting it for future generations, while at the same time allowing aquaculture to provide the demand and keeping the fish on the reefs. We see personally with ORA, we've got a clam farm on the Majuro Atoll over in the Marshall Islands. Our clam farm consistently employs 15 to 20 hardworking individuals. The income that we are providing them just from the sale of our tridacnid clams is well above what they can find jobs elsewhere in their economies. And because of such, the clams we are raising there's no need for wild collection at all. It completely accommodates the demand for clams here in the United States. So it kind of brings me to why these animals are important to the retail store. I think the two most important facets of this are going to be value and consumer confidence. Anytime you've got a large surplus of animals that you're bringing in consistently, the price is going to drive down. It's a natural aspect. I think, unfortunately, the byproduct of that decreasing price is also a decrease in value of the actual animal. It becomes expendable the less money you see with that. A aquacultured animal, yes, keeps prices consistent and low. However, it adds value by keeping a price that you don't see. One of the weird things with our industry is you don't see map pricing on live animals. You see it on pumps in order to maintain margins and maintain the value of these items, but you don't see it on live animals. And I think that is what aquaculture can provide, is a baseline price, a value to the animal. The additional most important thing, I think, is consumer confidence. I think people who have been around the industry long enough remember all too well wild-caught fish were terrible in the beginning, particularly clownfish. Any number of diseases, the collection methods were rudimentary at best, and oftentimes you lost a large portion of your fish just getting them to the hobbyist. Aquacultured fish do not have parasites, they don't have external diseases, they are coming from domestic suppliers, so they're not in transit any longer than overnight, typically, to less than 24 hours. That short supply chain really encourages customers, hobbyists, to be able to put them directly into their home aquarium and not worry about any of the negative consequences. Albeit, we do recommend always quarantine everything.
Yeah, so, I mean, to touch on what he was saying, with the consumer confidence, yeah, I mean, not only, back to the orchid dotterback and the Bengai cardinalfish, wild-caught specimens also just did not do well. You take a fish out of an ocean and throw it in a glass box, it kind of freaks out, not to mention the lengthy the supply chain, the boat ride. Now not only are species that were once, considered hard to come by, readily available, they're also really hardy, and that gets hobbyists excited. There's all of you have heard of that hobbyist that says, oh, I tried this, I tried that, it just failed, all of a sudden they're taking down their fish tank. But if they've got fish that thrive and do well, it gives them the confidence to want to buy a bigger tank. That's right, keeps them coming back for more. Marine ornamentals, as far as being aquacultured and available in your store, you really need a good balance of both wild caught and aquacultured, and particularly if there's fish that do not do well coming into the wild, have a historical tendency to just fail or become a rental fish, as I call them. You buy one every 6 months. If there's an aquacultured option available, chances are that hobbyist now has a pet.
So another thing you're seeing a lot in stores these days, the aquacultured animal is raising an awareness in hobbyists that wasn't present before. You're seeing an increase in demand for hobbyists who want to be supportive of the industry that they're in, knowing where it's come from. Your store offering both wild-caught and aquaculture kind of gives you that ability to raise that awareness and create hobbyists that are going to be in this industry for a long time. One of the things they also do is they turn your store into a destination. Again, when I touched on the designer clownfish created a customizable fish, so to speak. That can make your store a destination. Customers will come to you, look, I've got this fish in my mind, I've seen the pictures of it, I want this. You now have that ability to lure that customer in, make them a hobbyist for life with something that they can manifest in their own homes. And so that kind of leads to like what's next for the aquaculture industry. We've come very far. I think over time you've seen that the biggest defining factor has been food. So you saw it in the 1960s, and you've seen it now with the entire pelagic species has been a mystery to fish raisers for years, but now with foods, you're seeing those doors open. You're seeing gateways into species that we never thought we would see as captive bred, tangs, angelfish. From there, it's going to be wrasses, and we don't really know where else. But once people start unlocking those live foods, you're going to see all the fish that you've ever wanted will be 100% aquacultured and available to your home aquarium. You want to talk about public aquarium for me real quick?
Yeah. So one of the things, Fisheye Aquaculture, we not only provide fish for the pet industry, but we also provide fish for public aquariums, and that's important for would-be hobbyists. They're able to go into a facility and not only see those animals that everyone goes to see, the sharks, the big giant groupers, and everything, but they're able to see schools of fish, and then they see a little note that says, these were all, raised on a farm in Florida, as opposed to taken from a reef.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for spending it with us, and we'll see you guys on the floor. Jonathan and I will be standing over in the booth over there for ORA. So if you have any questions for either of us, you can find us over there after this. Thank you again.